any sound, Will. It's green. You got it? Okay. You hear me okay? When we divided the book of Ecclesiastes, I looked ahead to see what my first chapter would be. And I thought, oh no. If you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, it's like I've got to have a real downer chapter talking about oppression. But as I studied, and I'm going to have you look forward to this too, we're going to start off on the downside about oppression. But boy, that by the end, I hope you're as encouraged as I was about how positive a message is there for us at the end of that fourth chapter. It's not a very long chapter, only 16 verses. But let's begin with this, as I said, a downer part, this oppression. Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1. And then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. Can you come up with three more downer verses in the Bible? I would challenge you to try to find three. And that's why I say when I looked ahead and saw what I was going to be teaching, I said, wow, what a way to start. And I'm not kidding. Just as down as this is, it's just that far up by the end of this chapter. When we think of the oppression, we can think of the children of Israel. If you turn to Exodus chapter 9, we're going to read verses 6 through 19. When Moses and Aaron came and gave God's message that he wanted his people released, what was Pharaoh's answer? He made it clear that it was going to be a lot harder on them because of Moses and Aaron coming. I said Exodus 9, I mean Exodus 5. Sorry about that. Exodus 5, beginning in verse 6. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people that their foremen, saying, you are no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously, you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it, because they are lazy. Therefore they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let the labor be heavier on the men, and let them work at it, that they may pay no attention to false words. So the taskmasters of the people and their foremen went out to speak to the people, saying, thus says Pharaoh, I am not going to give you any straw. You go and get straw for yourselves, wherever you can find it, but none of your labor will be reduced. In other words, the quota of bricks had to be the same, even though they had to add the gathering of straw to it. Verse 12, so the people scattered through all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. And the taskmasters pressed them, saying, complete your work quota, your daily amount, just as when you had straw. Moreover, the foremen of the sons of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, why have you not completed your required amount earlier, either today or yesterday, in making brick as previously? Then the foreman of the sons of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, saying, why do you deal this way with your servants? There is no straw given to your servants, yet they keep saying us, make bricks, and behold, your servants are being beaten, but it is the fault of your own people. But he said, you are lazy, very lazy. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. So go now and work, for you shall be given no straw, yet you must deliver the quota of bricks. And the foreman of the sons of Israel saw that they were in trouble, because they were told, you must not reduce your daily amount of bricks. And you know how that continues. We don't have time to do it all. But once these same laborers saw Moses and Aaron, they said, look what you've done to us. When you got here, things got a lot worse. And what they were talking about was oppression. And that's what we see in Ecclesiastes when we talk about how sore the oppression was on people in the past, but we have oppression today, don't we? Go ahead and put that first slide up if you would, Will. I put up here on the top something that's been in the news a whole lot in the last few months. Active oppression is exemplified. You can just use a still photo of that policeman with his knee on a guy's neck, George Floyd, and we look at that as a very active example of oppression. But what I want to spend time on is not talking about the George Floyd case, but talk about how or ask the question, are we guilty of passive oppression? Now that might sound strange, but if you turn over to Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 44, then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteousness to everlasting life, the righteous people. So the Lord is using a parable there where he's talking about the sheep and the goats, basically, the good and the evil. The evil weren't evil in the sense of something like we see with George Floyd. The evil simply did not show attention to those who needed attention. And when Jesus said, I was sick and you didn't visit me, I was hungry, you gave me no food, the answer was, Lord, when did we see you like this? What a great answer to say, take the least of your brethren, and if you didn't do it to him, you didn't do it to me. So sometimes there's oppression that takes place in what we would call neglect. We can see it with little children. DFACS gets involved. There's neglect. There's a failure to get food to the children or provide clean places for them to rest and sleep. And yet it can be neglect for older people as well. Also, we got the example of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. We'll just read verses 19 through 31 now. Luke chapter 16. I've often taught this asking, can you find anything evil that the rich man did? Can you find any example of him getting his riches by cheating, even by gambling? Is there anything that says how he got his riches? We can assume that maybe his riches were honest gain. But verse 19 says, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who fared sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to them, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. So would you agree with me that Lazarus had an oppressive life? We've got pretty inclement weather out there this morning. It didn't say that when it was sunny, Lazarus laid at the gate of the rich man, does it? You know, when it was bad weather, he had a shelter somewhere. It doesn't say that. As Jesus is telling about this, I assume that Lazarus was out there in the pouring rain, out there in the cold. It was an oppressive life. And Jesus pointed out to the rich man, now Lazarus is in comfort, and you're the one, we could substitute the word, you're the one being oppressed. So when Solomon, we started off this study reminding ourselves that Solomon had the chance to ask God for riches, fame, everything, but he very humbly said he was like a little child and did not know how to lead God's people. And he asked for wisdom, that he would, in an understanding heart, that he would be able to know how to lead the children. And so here we see some of this wisdom of Solomon when he talks about that there is an oppression in the earth that is bad enough that people wish they were dead. And then he says even worse than wishing they were dead, there's an oppression where it would be better not to have ever been born. That's one thing to have a life and you say, well, the first X number of years of my life were okay, but now I wish I was dead. But what about saying, I wish I was never born? The one that would better for him if he was never born first comes to mind with Judas. We won't look to these passages, but if you want to, you can make a note. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, and Mark 4, verse 21, Jesus prophesies that someone's going to betray him, and woe to him by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. And he says to all his apostles there, it would be better for that man if he would have never been born. That's pretty scary about Judas. There was no, well, Judas did some good things for us. He kept the treasury and did a good job for a while. There was none of that. That the man that was going to betray Jesus, it would have been better if he had never been born. Now, of course, we have to look at Job. Job chapter 2. So if you turn with me to Job. They say Job's the oldest book in the Bible, and that's the way you kind of remember that it's even before Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Job chapter 2, beginning in verse 3. And of course, Job is talking to the people around him. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, for there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God. I think I went back too far, too. Once again, I missed it. I said chapter 9 a while ago, and I meant chapter 5. And here I need you to go to Job 3, not Job 2. Verse 3 of Job 3 is when Job is speaking and says, let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. Think how joyous that usually is when the midwife or the doctor says, congratulations, it's a boy, a healthy boy. And Job says there was a time of congratulations, but he wishes that day had not come about. He was already in such misery. He'd lost not only all his possessions, but all of his children. And he wished the day would perish that he was born. It even gets more intense. The whole next several verses speak to that concept, but verse 10 says that he wishes that day, verse 9, that day, the light of day would have never come to that day. Verse 10, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb or hide trouble from my eyes. So Job is our example of someone that things are so bad that he not only wishes he was dead, he wishes he had never been born, and that's exactly what the wisdom of Solomon is referring to in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 3 and verse 3. Beginning verse 2 again, so I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one that has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. We're going to go now to the concept of toil and travail. And I spent a good bit of time looking in the different versions. I've been reading from New American Standard. They've got two of those now. This is 1995 translation. They got a newer one now. But toil and labor, and especially the word travail, if you're in King James or New King James, travail is usually associated with a woman having a child. Back in Genesis chapter 3, when God had cursed the serpent and said he was going to crawl on his belly for the rest of the existence of a serpent, eat dust. Sometimes people say that about a fast car in front of you, but the Lord said the serpent would eat dust the rest of his life. But he told Eve that there was going to be travail, that there was going to be pain in childbirth. And there are various references throughout the Old Testament and then even in the New Testament where it's referred to that there was travail as a woman giving birth. So I'm looking at travail as a little more extreme than the word toil. There can be good and honest toil. We sing a hymn, "Consider the Lilies of the Field," and that's taken from Matthew 6, verse 28. The lilies of the field, they toil not, neither do they spin. And Jesus said, and yet I say that Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed as one of these. So like we said, Solomon asked for wisdom, asked for understanding, and God said, because that's what you asked for, you're going to be richer than anybody. You're going to have more power, more prestige than anybody. But in all of his glory, if you look at some of these beautiful new flowers that are coming out in the spring, Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like these little wildflowers that God puts out. But that says that they don't toil to do that, and yet there's a lot of references to toil and labor that are very honest and to be commended. Now, if you would turn to Genesis chapter 11, because we're going to use that to try to explain what Solomon's getting at in the middle verses of this chapter. Verse 8 in Ecclesiastes 4, and keep your finger in that Genesis 11, that's where we're going to go next. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither son nor brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Again, this is honest labor. Indeed, his eyes were satisfied with riches, were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity and is a grievous task. I think we've all seen that. Sometimes you'll see a man who works hard and has accumulated a lot of this world's goods, and you realize that, well, his heirs have it made. Maybe they'll take that and use it wisely, and they'll be good businessmen. But what about the man, and we've all known them, that you say, does he have any family? And the answer is no. He doesn't even have brothers or sisters. He doesn't have any children. And the question obviously comes, particularly as he gets up in years, who's going to get all this stuff? What's that? Yep, Uncle Sam will get it, that's for sure. I thought you knew somebody in that case. But we've all thought like that. In fact, look in there as you read Ecclesiastes 4, you'll see that the word envy is used, that sometimes when we look at all this, we have envy. I'm about to introduce the subject of synergy. And there's a little bit of a parable here. He starts off in verse 9, 2 are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, one will lift up his companion, but woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. And then here's where we get the analogy that I have on the slide. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. A poor yet wise lad is better off than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. So what I have here, I'm trying to depict one strand. Dudley studied into this. If that's a 550 cord, then it'll hold 550 pounds. But if you weave that, and he says a 3/4 cord is not easily broken, so there's a little yellow one in that mix, and it's woven together. And I'm wanting to introduce this concept of synergy. We'll introduce it with Genesis chapter 11. there's an amazing thing, and this is what I was referring to as being so positive, something that God has given us. Every morning when we wake up and we thank God for our life, for our health, for our opportunities, one thing I want you to add to it, if you haven't already, I thank you that when I work with Curtis, it's more than the two of us. It really is a scientific principle. Let's say with this kind of weather, there's a tree that falls across a road. And I can get a chainsaw, and there's a certain amount of that I can move by myself. If I could move a third of that tree by myself, and then someone comes to help me like Curtis, you say, well, it won't be a third, it'll be 2/3. But you all know with two of us, we could move the whole tree. 1 + 1 equals at least 3. And the Lord gave this in the church when he gave the important teaching through the apostles that the hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you. It's just amazing that he made it human beings. Not only did he give us a wonderful ability to do things, but when there's more than one together in a single task, it multiplies. Someone else has suggested 2 + 2 = 5. Any way you want to look at it, it doesn't equal just what it looks like arithmetically it would be. Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. This is the account of the Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. They had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And listen to this part right here. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down in there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. I talked about things in our current society that everyone sees as oppression. I mentioned George Floyd. What are we seeing as a positive goal of so many leaders throughout the world? Have you heard of I'd like to have a little discussion, really. I've been doing all the talking. Have you heard of the concept of one world order? Tim says yes. What about that Coca-Cola commercial years ago? We are the world. We are the children. Isn't it just wonderful? Everybody comes together. Everybody's one. Nobody can say that God is more important than Allah. Some people believe in Allah, and some people worship as Muslims, and we're all just one people. We're all God's children. It sounds good. Ken. Right. You see it in individual little situations, but there's a big furor now. Apparently they're passing a law that says you have to have an excuse to get a absentee ballot. You have to say, hey, look, I'm in the hospital, or I'm going to be out of town. And this whole concept of, hey, it's all one world anyway. Whoever is now in Guatemala or transiting Mexico, when he gets up here, if he's up here in time for the election, we want him to vote. Right? It is amazing. And like I said, it's almost like the Pied Pipers, that fictional story where all the children are dancing to the music, follow the Pied Piper up into the mountain. It sounds enticing. Just one world order, one government, everybody's equal. We always know the ones at the top are severely unequal. That's always been the case. This first happened at the Tower of Babel. If one world order was a good idea, then God would have just praised what was going on at Babel. God's the one that created us, to have this synergy that I'm talking about. And it's amazing, if you just start looking at that word, the Lord looked and saw. And the same word, us, I spent a little bit of time studying Hebrew, even though I don't know Hebrew. And the word, when the people of the city said, let us build this tower, let us make a name for themselves, that Hebrew word is the same word when God says, let us go down and confound their language. So this overlaps with what we've been studying, the sermons we've been having about the Godhead. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. It is us. In Genesis, let us make man in our image. So look at this right here. At the Tower of Babel, let us go down and confound the language. Sherry?
There's also humanism that's crept in, and people that are famous, like Oprah Winfrey, and she is a humanist, and she has actually stated that we are God.
Right. That collectively, mankind is, like you say, God, but the whole concept of humanism, if it benefits humanity, if what you do on this earth brings glory to the human being collectively, that supplants bringing God the glory. Betty.
We could look at this example also of the Tower of Babel, that let us build a tower, that let us, they let God out.
There you go. The
So
us.
if we don't let God in, we better watch out.
Betty makes the point that let us build a tower. That I mean, let us ask God to bless us in this tower. They were leaving him out. As Sherry's pointing out with humanism, they were going to be important. They were going to make a name for themselves. But what's amazing is God had given them the power to do that. That just, first time I became aware of that God said, now nothing that they imagine to do will be impossible for them. He gave that blessing.
And see what happened to them.
Yeah, it didn't work out well. But do you agree with me that if God wanted one world order, he could have let it go from there?
God could have done it.
Everybody had one language. Wouldn't that be a first step? Not have to learn other languages. Everybody just has one language. Of course, now we don't even want one language in this country. I thought about when I first put that up there, I would say that what I wanted to talk about was a 50-cent word, but it's a good word. I don't know that we could come up with a synonym that would mean, maybe the print's a little too small, but the interaction of elements that when combined produce a total effect that is greater than the sum of the individual elements. All of you have had occasions in your work when you can see a principle like that working. It is just amazing. The most simple would be rope. I mentioned the 550 cord. If you wove 3 550s together, Dudley, I don't know what the number would be, but it wouldn't be 1,500. It'd be more like 3,000 pounds that you could hold with that rope. And so that's the illustration that's used by the wisest man, that a 3/4 cord is not easily broken. Any other examples from work you've done? Billy, I would think that you've seen that. You ever, with a backhoe, do you ever have a rock that it looks almost like you can't pick it up, that you get under this edge, you come over and get under that edge, and maybe it's too big too. So if there was I'm thinking of a big flat rock, and you had another friend with a backhoe and said, now look, when I get this side up, I may not know what I'm talking about here, if you could get on that other side, we can get this thing moved,
I've got two pretty square rocks over the house.
Wow.
They come from over our Chatsworth.
30 by 30 inches?
Now, they're probably about like that. They probably weigh about a ton apiece.
Yeah.
I just
But-
pick them up and sell them.
But when you got help, it made it a lot easier, didn't it? And usually like that two machines or two people working on something does a lot more than 2 times what that would be. You said they weighed about a ton. If you could take care of one that weighed 1,500 pounds by yourself, you know, you need help to move it. Chances are, once you get help with that, you've been able to carry a lot more than a ton. You know, you'll be able to move a lot more.
Got a rock at the house and come off Jack River of Chuck Sissons.
How many? How many people?
It
Just two of you?
just barely wouldn't pick it up, so it on the back of the truck.
But the back of the backhoe would pick up too, wouldn't it?
No, it was a big truck.
Okay. You get the philosophical question people ask if God can do anything. And I think this is kind of a blasphemous question. Can God make a rock too big for him to pick up? You heard that before? Yeah, like I said, it's blasphemous. God has unlimited in every way. But the real question is what Billy's given us some illustration of. If you've got a huge rock, 30 inches square, 2,000 pounds, all it takes is more than one man. It may take two, it may take three, whatever it takes, it can be moved. And the pyramids are certainly an example of that. Those huge stones. It's been a while since I read. Anybody remember how much those rectangles weighed? First they had to hew them, they had to cut them out, and then I think they put them on rollers, had people pulling and people pushing and had them on rollers. But by enough people together, they had an effect like they had with the Tower of Babel here. They got an amazing amount of work done. And that was this word that we use, synergy, that two makes more than just one working together. Verse 9 is where we got that to start with again. Two are better than one. The illustration of if one of them falls, the other one picks them up. Also, if it's cold weather and one of them is in danger of dying of hypothermia, you get two of them together and they make it fine. It's not like you're halfway dead of hypothermia. The two together create warmth. Verse 11. What about verse 12? What about when there's conflict? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. You think you've seen that play out just with... How many of you have had military training that includes some hand-to-hand concepts? There you go. You feel comfortable giving us an example of just one exercise you do? The one I think of that it just amazes me if a guy's coming at you with a knife and you're by yourself, you know how you're going to defeat that if that's all you got, not if you've got a better weapon. But with two people working together, he's a lot more easily defeated, right? Can you think of an example like that in your training? Just to complete that, if I understand if someone doesn't want to speak out, but it's just simple principle. The only way that I was involved with this, because my military training had to do with flying and being above the infantry type stuff. But once I took some training about the problems they were having with the cockpit being attacked, it was amazing to me that if the guy's coming forward to the cockpit and he's got this knife and his idea is to disable the pilots, the first guy can engage him, but the second guy just grabs him and helps him go forward. He's not expecting to be grabbed and to be thrown forward into the instrument panel and the throttles and all that kind of thing. And there's where two guys working together, even if that first guy gets cut by the knife, that second guy is taking care of that particular problem. They armed all the people taking that course, and then it gave you time to get the weapon out and defeat the hijacking. Didn't mean to get into this, but I've had people ask me, well, when you go on a commercial flight, nowadays the biggest issue is COVID, but you know, what's the chance of having armed people in the cockpit? And it's more like, it's very rare to not have someone in the cockpit that's armed. It's just about every flight. And it's all voluntary. The guys volunteer, and in my case, I went to Artesia, New Mexico, You pay your own expenses. But that all changed because of September 11th, 2001. And certainly when we read in the Bible, verse 12, and if one can overpower him who is alone, you realize that human conflict has always been there. And here the wisest man is talking about, what if you can be overpowered by one individual? If there's two of you, then you will not be overpowered. Remember Jesus, when he sent people out on the limited commission, he sent them out by twos. It's a good principle even today. Even if you're just knocking doors and invite people to a meeting, it's good to have another person with you. Sometimes what you're overpowering is a dog. Verse 12 of Ecclesiastes 4, and if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. Boy, that hits hard, doesn't it? A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king. It reminds me of another proverb of Solomon's. Sherry laughs because I get so tickled by it. But do you remember the one that says that a live dog is better than a dead lion? Since we're talking about protecting ourselves, what if a guy had his own pet lion, and that lion was right there at his front door, and he's so proud of his lion? Well, even just a dog is better than if that lion was dead. So it doesn't seem like it takes much wisdom to say that, but it's very similar to what Solomon said here in verse 13. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. What about that principle? We're talking about a poor lad, talking about him rising all the way up to being a king. Solomon had this in his own lineage, didn't he? Who was Solomon's father? David. He was poor in the sense that he spent all day, every day guarding the sheep. His brothers had greater positions within the family. I think he would be the one that when he goes out to take care of the sheep to bring food to his brothers. So this poor lad rose all the way up to be king, and Solomon doesn't say, take my father, but he might as well. But then notice this. Once David became king, verse 15 says that the living thronged to the side of the second lad who replaces him. Is he talking about himself here? David's life ended in a lot of turmoil and trouble and fighting the forces that arrayed under Absalom. But I think Solomon sees him as the lad that replaced David. That's just my opinion. But he says people have thronged to support him, verse 15. And then we end up with verse 16. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. That's a little difficult for me. He just got through saying the second lad will have people throng to support him. But now he says there's no end to all the people who were before them. And even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind. I said we'd end very positively, and that positive thing is how great synergy is. How when God gave us the abilities that he gave us, the ability to make a living, the ability to live on this earth, he gave us also that in the church, he ordained that all things through the church, that the manifold wisdom of God would come forth. But with the church, 2 are better than 1. 3 is not 3 times that, it multiplies. And this is such a great blessing. And yet, you got the warning that's throughout Ecclesiastes. Even if you talk about that second, you get the one poor lad that rises to be king. You get the second one that comes along, and people throng to support him. But I guess when you're talking about earthly power, who's poor, who's a king, who's wealthy, who's not. Really what you're talking about is something that will all end at the end of time, at Judgment Day. And so we will all point to when Solomon says the conclusion of the matter is to fear God and keep his commandments. And that's why he ends so many of these lessons, like this one, chapter 4, on really whether you're talking about being poor and becoming a king or whatever, it's all vanity, striving after the wind. Any other questions or comments? Thank you.